This case is a federal case. It's a federal case because it has to do with federal authorities that caught someone that was growing marijuana in their own home. So let's go ahead and take a look at the issue. Mary Jane, that's right, Mary Jane is arrested after the Drug Enforcement Agency believed that marijuana was being cultivated in her home after using a thermal imaging camera that identified excessive heat emanating from her home. A search warrant was issued by a judge based on those images from the camera, and they stormed into the house and basically found the marijuana plants that were growing under heating elements, heating lamps, and they confiscated the marijuana and they arrested Mary Jane. So, where does this case go forth? Well, it goes before the federal district court, and there happens to be one in Santa Ana. Now, why is it going to a federal district court, not a California Superior Court? Because it was a federal official, a drug enforcement agency. That's a federal official. Wasn't a police officer, wasn't a California highway patrolman. It was a federal official working for the Drug Enforcement Agency. Think of brother-in-law Hank in Breaking Bad. He was the brother-in-law for Walter White, who actually worked for the Drug Enforcement Agency, which is a federal agency. All right, so the trial is going to take place. A jury is impaneled. Evidence will be used, the marijuana that was confiscated, and there was also electricity records that will also be introduced as well, showing that she was using an exorbitant amount of electricity in her home, more than the average person. And the case will proceed. The case then concludes, and the jury comes up with its verdict, and the jury decides that Mary Jane ought to be convicted, or is guilty, by unanimous vote, and therefore is convicted and sentenced. However, Mary Jane's lawyer decides to appeal. So the question is, where would you appeal this case? Well, you don't go to a California court, you have to go to a federal court. And we actually have a U.S. Court of Appeals located in Pasadena. The case is now going to be heard before a panel of 3 judges at the U.S. Court of Appeals. Now, California is in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and we actually have a courthouse located in Pasadena. So a panel of 3 judges would listen to the lawyers make their arguments. Mary Jane's lawyer would argue that the evidence should have never been allowed to be presented at trial, because Mary Jane's argument is going to be the only reason why they got a search warrant is because they got information based on images from a thermal imaging camera. Now, Mary Jane's lawyer would argue that we should not have federal authorities going around people's homes using thermal imaging cameras. I mean, what other heat might they see in people's bedrooms or elsewhere? Anyway, Mary Jane's lawyer is going to argue that is not a device that federal authorities should be using. Well, Mary Jane's lawyer makes the argument. The prosecuting attorney on the other side will also argue that the conviction should be upheld, and the U.S. Courts of Appeals in Pasadena will make its decision, and it decides the conviction is upheld. Now what? Well, as you can imagine, Mary Jane's lawyer will appeal. But before Mary Jane's lawyer appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court, they have an extra opportunity to appeal at the U.S. Court of Appeals. And that is by requesting an en banc hearing. Now we're going to have an en banc hearing. What is an en banc hearing? Well, that's where you're going to get judges from the Circuit Court of Appeals actually come together and join with a group of 10 into a group of 10 to 12 judges. So an en banc hearing is an opportunity to have a second chance of appeal before the U.S. Courts of Appeals. And instead of having 3 judges basically hear a person's case, now you're going to have a panel of 10 to 12 judges from the Circuit Court of Appeals to hear the lawyers make their arguments before that court. So this is a second opportunity that someone can use in order to appeal before it gets to the Supreme Court. So an en banc hearing is impaneled. Again, they're just going to hear information from the lawyers, and the en banc panel decides the case, and they decide to uphold the conviction. Well, now what? Well, as you can imagine, Mary Jane's lawyer has another and one final last appeal, and that's with the U.S. Supreme Court. And again, it can only reach the U.S. Supreme Court if at least 4 justices, called the Rule of 4, agree to hear the case. Well, let's just suggest they do agree to hear the case, and they issue a writ of certiorari. Once 4 justices agreed to call this case up and issue a writ of certiorari, the case will now be presented before the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, the lawyer for Mary Jane will write a legal brief. The Attorney General's, which is called the Solicitor General in this case, the Solicitor General, who currently under Trump's administration, his name is Noel Francisco. He is the Solicitor General that always argues before the Supreme Court on behalf of the U.S. government. So he would present his legal brief and his reasoning why he believes that the conviction should be upheld and the evidence should be allowed. Mary Jane's lawyer would argue that the evidence shouldn't be allowed, that it was an unreasonable search. And as I said, even the ACLU might join in. They might file a legal brief, and that legal brief would be called an amicus curiae brief, friend of the court brief. And they would argue as well that this thermal imaging camera was used as a search, which they would argue is an unreasonable search in violation of the Fourth Amendment. Well, it reaches, the Supreme Court hears these arguments by all these lawyers, and then they make their decision. When they make their decision, a majority vote, they decide, you know what? The conviction is going to be vacated, and we are going to remand this case back down to the original court. Now that the Supreme Court has decided to remand this case, now the case will be brought down to the Federal District Court, but when they remanded this case, they told the Federal District Court, you cannot allow the marijuana to be presented as evidence at trial based on the exclusionary rules, since it was since that search warrant was issued based on information from the thermal imaging camera. The Supreme Court ruled that that evidence should not be used at its original trial. Well, as you can imagine, if you can't use the if you can't use the marijuana to try to convict Mary Jane of cultivating marijuana, then there's no case. So Mary Jane is free to get high again. Case dismissed.